In our last lesson, we saw that the war between England and Spain motivated the English to establish or to desire to establish colonies in the New World. But there are actually a number of other factors in the 16th and 17th centuries that motivated the English to establish colonies in the New World. And today, in this lesson, we're going to look at these factors. These factors include the desire for overseas trade and opening new markets in distant areas, the poverty that was in England at this time, the fact that in England you had widespread religious persecution, and also the fact that especially in the 16th century, England experienced widespread political turmoil and civil war. So let's begin by looking at the overseas trade as a factor in the English desire to establish colonies. Traditionally, English merchants traded in wool. English wool was especially prized, and usually English merchants sold their wool to places in the Netherlands or in Italy where it would be made into cloth. But by the mid-16th century, the market for wool had become just too big. I mean, there was just too much product being produced and prices were fluctuating. And so English merchants were looking for ways to try to diversify their investments so that they wouldn't have all their money in the wool trade. So as a result, by the middle of the 16th century, you had English merchants who wanted to go out and maybe find new areas, new markets, and to bring luxury goods from these areas to English consumers. Now, the problem with overseas trade and going to distant markets was that this was a very risky proposition. There were pirates, there were storms at sea, and so to try to lower the risk, what merchants would do was to organize what we call joint stock companies. Joint stock companies are kind of like the forefathers of the modern corporation. And what merchants would do is they would pool their investments, they would pool their resources into a company that would be, whose job would be to go out and to find these distant markets and bring these luxury goods back to English consumers. Now, the fact that in the mid-16th century you had this flood of precious metals from gold and silver from the New World, this provided English merchants with the capital, with the money they needed to start these new companies and to start a number of joint stock companies in the 16th century. Now, what we see is in the 16th century there are a wave of these new companies that were founded. These companies sought to establish markets in Russia, like the Muscovy Company. There was the Guinea Company that wanted to establish markets in West Africa. There was the Levant Company that wanted to establish markets in the Ottoman Empire, what would be today the Near East. And all these companies, all they hoped to do, what they wanted to do was to get from the monarch a charter that would grant them a monopoly for trade in that particular area. And that way they would have a very good profit margin because they would be the one, only that company could trade in that particular area. Just to give you an idea of how intense this wave of speculation went, there's the case of Martin Frobisher. Martin Frobisher founded a company. It was called the Cathay Company, or Cathay was another name for China, the China Company. And he created a company and had investors, and he claimed that he could find a Northwest Passage, a direct sea route across the Western Hemisphere that would take merchant ships directly to the Far East, to China. And even though this Northwest Passage had never been discovered, he found investors willing to invest in this company. Now, eventually, in 1578, when the company was founded, eventually Martin Frobisher actually made the voyage, and he died one of a number of English explorers, and he died actually in the process of making one of these voyages to find this Northwest Passage. Now, for the most part, these companies went bankrupt. The only one company that was just a guaranteed success was the East India Company that had a monopoly for trade with India. And it was founded in 1601, and it went on to have great success, and eventually Great Britain came to dominate the entire Indian subcontinent by virtue of the East India Company. Now, I mention these companies, these joint stock companies, because these companies would be very instrumental in the founding of a number of colonies in the American colonies, and they provided the capital to establish these colonies. All right, another big factor besides the entrance in overseas trade, another big factor was the fact that in the 16th and 17th centuries, you had a great deal of poverty. In the 17th century especially, the English peasantry, the peasants, were experiencing a great deal of hardship. Now, it's important to remember that in the 17th century, 90% of the population of England and of Europe in general were made of agricultural laborers and tenant farmers known as peasants. And now in the 16th and 17th centuries, their standard of living experienced a decline. And one of the factors in this decline was a practice known as enclosures. In fact, it's called the enclosure movement. Now, what is this movement? Well, you see, in your typical English traditional village, going back to the Middle Ages, the peasants worked in the village and they worked on their lands, and surrounding the village would be property known as the common lands. And this was land that belonged to everybody in the village. And, well, actually it belonged to the landlord, but in return for a small fee, the peasants could use this land. And this land could be used for pasturage of animals, it could be used for hunting, for fishing. It was just open land. Now, in the 16th and 17th centuries, though, aristocrats saw that they could make a lot more money if they could perhaps enclose these common lands and turn it over into either raising more crops for themselves or use it for raising sheep. Because remember, the wool trade was such a big lucrative trade in this day. So by act of parliament, landlords would get these lands enclosed, hence enclosure, and that would mean that these peasants could no longer access these lands. Now, the result of the enclosure movement was that landlords, they made great profits, but peasants suffered a serious decline in their standard of living because they could not access those common lands as they had been accustomed to do. Now, another factor, another reason there was hard times, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries, was because of inflation. When I already mentioned that because of the Spanish exploration and New World empire, all this gold and silver was flooding Europe. And this was used as currency. And so the result was that with all this gold and silver out there, that meant that prices increased. And now, historically, whenever you have high inflation, wages do not keep up with inflation. So the result was that over time, peasants found themselves in a situation where their wages, working on the lands, were not keeping up with the cost of living. And then on top of that, in the 17th century, the English kings, James I and Charles I, they would debase the currency. And by that I mean they would actually lower the gold content in the coinage so that they could create more gold to cover their many expenses. And this debasing of the currency only served to make inflation that much worse for the peasantry and for the people in general in the 17th century. Now, yet another factor for problems, especially in the 17th century, was what we called it a climate change. Now, in the 17th century, it wasn't global warming, but it was global cooling. In fact, the scientists refer to the 17th century as a little ice age. In fact, temperatures in the 17th century across Europe were much colder than they are today. And cold temperatures translates into shorter growing seasons, and the result was that the 17th century saw a wave of poor harvests, and the result was that there was less food out there, and that resulted in widespread malnutrition. Now, a malnourished population is also a population that can be easily affected by epidemic disease. And so what we see in the 17th century was that, especially in the early and mid-17th centuries, that epidemic disease and malnutrition and this lack of food were widespread across England. Now, as a result of this situation, what we see is that across England, and especially in the early and mid-17th century, is that English peasants were so desperate that they were willing to sacrifice their freedom in exchange for a new opportunity, a new start. And what they do is they become what we call indentured servants. An English peasant, usually a man, sometimes it would be a woman, but a man would agree to, in return for passage to the New World, would agree to give up their freedom and to basically become slaves for a set number of years, usually anywhere between 4 and 7 years. So peasants were willing to sacrifice their personal freedom and become slaves for the opportunity to get out of England and start a new life and maybe get land and start something new in the New World, in the American colonies. And we'll see that was often the case in the 17th century. Now, another factor that would lead people to leave England and come to the American colonies was the fact that you had widespread religious persecution. Now, before 1692, and so for the 16th and in the 17th centuries, all subjects of the English king were expected to have the same religion as the King of England. Now, the Church of England was the Anglican Church, and all people were required by law to attend church and to pay the tithe, which would be 10% of their income. That they had to. And failure to attend church or failure to pay the tithe, it could result in imprisonment, and in some cases, even execution. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, what we see is that there were a number of different groups of people who did not support the Church of England and were subject to persecution, and therefore saw the New World as an opportunity to find a new life and to practice their religion without being subject to persecution. So who were these groups? Well, there were a number of them. One group would be the Roman Catholics. The Anglican Church was a Protestant church, and there were actually a substantial number of Roman Catholics, especially in the northern and central parts of England. Now, and also in Ireland. It's important to remember that the King of England was also, ever since the 13th or the 12th century, the King of Ireland. And Ireland was predominantly Roman Catholic. So, and also, after 1603, the thrones of England and Scotland were united. So the King of Scotland, James VI, became King James I of England. And now in Scotland, in the Highlands of Scotland, especially in the mountains of Scotland and on the Scottish Islands, there were also large numbers of Roman Catholics as well. So you did have a substantial Roman Catholic population who were unhappy with the Anglican Church. Another group of people who were unhappy with the Anglican Church were English Calvinists. These would be Englishmen who followed the ideas of the Protestant reformer John Calvin. Now, the Calvinists the English Calvinists were divided into two groups, Puritans and Separatists. Now, the Puritans were called Puritans because they wanted to reform the Anglican Church. They wanted to purify it. They felt that there were too many vestiges or remainders of the old Roman Catholic Church, and they wanted to root those out and purify the Church of England. And there were many Puritans, especially in areas of southern England, in the towns and villages of that area. Another group of English Calvinists were Separatists. Now, Separatists and Puritans, they had the same beliefs, except that English Calvinists English Separatists believed that the Anglican Church or the Church of England was so corrupt that they needed to completely break away from it and just completely start a new church. That's why they were called Separatists. And as we'll see, Puritans and Separatists would be very important in the establishment of new colonies in the New World. Now, another group that arose by the middle of the 17th century were people called Quakers. Now, Quakers didn't call themselves Quakers. They called themselves the Society of Friends. And Quakers were Protestants who rejected completely all liturgy or organized worship. When the Society of Friends or Quakers got together, they would basically break out into spontaneous prayer and singing. In fact, they earned their name Quakers because during their religious services, when they got together, they would literally quake with emotion. And that's where we get the term Quakers. Quakers believed that God's Spirit, His Holy Spirit, would direct their lives. The inner life, they talked about this inner life that would lead them in the right direction. Now, a thing about Quakers was that they rejected all titles and differences of social class, so Quakers would often refer to everybody as a brother, brother this and brother that, and didn't use any or recognize any titles like Mr. or Sir. So Quakers were seen as a strange, small group in England and were despised by many for their different beliefs, their dissenting beliefs. Now another group of another persecuted group in England would be the Baptists. Now the Baptists were originally separatists, and some of these separatists were inspired by some of the ideas of a group of people called Mennonites that were in Germany and the Netherlands, and they came to embrace adult baptism. They were called Baptists because they embraced the idea that one had to be baptized not as a baby or a child, which was the common practice in all the other churches, but one had to be baptized as an adult when one fully understood what it meant to be a Christian. So the Baptist church was a growing church in England, and many Baptists would come and establish themselves and settle in the New World. Now another group would be Scottish Calvinists. We've talked about English Calvinists. There were Scottish Calvinists, and they were known as Presbyterians. You know, you've probably heard of the Presbyterian Church. Presbyterian Church was originally just the Scottish Calvinist church. Now there are many Presbyterians in the south parts of Scotland, and there are also large numbers of Presbyterians in Northern Ireland. Beginning around 1600 or so, large numbers of Scottish Presbyterians settled in Northern Ireland, and they became known as the Scotch-Irish, and many of them were Presbyterians. So all these different groups, at least in the 17th century, were known as dissenting groups: Presbyterians, Quakers, Separatists, Puritans, and Roman Catholics, and all these groups would eventually find a home in the different colonies of the New World and would come to the New World to escape religious persecution. Now, yet another factor that caused people to leave England and come to the colonies was the fact that in the 17th century especially, England suffered from extreme political unrest. And in fact, in the middle of the 17th century, England struggled under a civil war. Now, this English Civil War was a struggle between the English monarchs, the kings, and the English Parliament. Now, let's talk about this. The English Parliament was very important because it established a political tradition that would be followed by the colonists in the New World. Now, the Parliament has its origins in the Middle Ages, and it represented the landowning people of England. Now, you've got to remember that the landowning, property-owning people of England only comprised about 10% of the population, and it included mostly aristocrats and some wealthy merchants. Now, the tradition was that when the king summoned Parliament, you'd have elections, and the people who could vote would elect representatives to the House of Commons. Now, that was the lower house of the Parliament. Now, the upper house of the Parliament was called the House of Lords, and it was made up of the great aristocrats of England. And so to be a member of the House of Lords, you had to be appointed by the king. And usually membership was hereditary. Now, in England, there emerged a tradition that all laws and all taxes had to be approved by Parliament before they could take effect. Now, when we get to the reign of James I and Charles I, this is when there were problems. Now, another tradition among the English was that all Englishmen had certain rights. All freemen had certain rights. And one of the most important of these rights was the right to property, the idea that you could not be deprived of property without a trial by jury. Now, James I and Charles I, they believed in in an idea that was called divine right of kings. They believed that their power to rule came from God and that they answered to no one but God. And they really weren't too thrilled with this idea of Parliament. So what we see happening is that over time there was increasing conflict between these kings, first James and then his son Charles, and with members of Parliament. Now, in fact, Charles I, between 1629 and 1640, he didn't even call Parliament. It was called his period of personal rule. And it was at this time that Parliament didn't even meet. And what happened at this time was Charles I would impose laws and taxes without getting Parliament's approval. He also tried to change the Anglican Church and to impose some practices that were reminiscent of the practices of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, these policies of Charles I were a leading cause of the English Civil War between 1642 and 1649. And in this conflict, you had, on one hand, Charles I and his loyalists or royalists who supported him, and the other we had Parliament. Now, by the time we get to the middle of the 17th century, Puritans had grown in enough numbers that they came to dominate Parliament. Now, warfare between the forces of Parliament and the forces of the king broke out in 1642, and this war ended with a victory for Parliament. In fact, in 1649, Charles I was found guilty of treason and actually executed by Parliament. Now, after the victory of the parliamentary forces, the leader of the Parliament's army was a man by the name of Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan. And after the death and execution of King Charles I, England was declared a republic or a commonwealth. And Cromwell assumed the title of Lord Protector as the chief executive. He didn't take the title king, but just assumed the title Lord Protector. And it was at this time that the Anglican Church was reformed along Puritan lines. Now, this Republic of England, which even had a written constitution, didn't last very long. It was based on the fact that Cromwell had the support of the army. And when he died in 1658, his regime crumbled, the Commonwealth collapsed, and there was widespread support for a return of the monarchs. And so eventually, the old Parliament got back together, and they met in 1660, and they asked Charles II, the son of Charles I, to return to become the king of England once again. And this is known as the Restoration. And it was at this time that the Puritan reforms that had been earlier enacted, those were all annulled, and the old Anglican Church was restored. Now, Charles II showed a lot more respect for Parliament than his father or grandfather, and this was a time of political peace. Now, these events in England, these wars, the Civil War, this also had a huge impact. During the time of Charles's personal rule, in the 1629 to 1641, that was a time when thousands of Puritans left their homes to come to the New World and to settle in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Later on, in the mid-17th century, when Cromwell's regime was in control, English royalists, especially from northern England and central England, they left their homes and came in large numbers and settled in the colonies, especially in the Chesapeake region. So we can see that that would be a way in which political factors in England came to motivate people to come and settle in the American colonies. So that's what that's our talk today. Next, we'll be talking about the establishment of colonies in the New World.